Since the invention of the internal combustion engine by humans, oil has played a decisive role in human development and quickly become a key factor in determining the outcome of wars among countries. Nowadays, China has become the world's largest importer of oil. The consequence of excessive reliance on imported crude oil is that once subject to an embargo by the United States, China's economy may face a serious crisis. In World War II, the United States defeated Japan and Germany by relying on this means. In the future, it is very likely that the United States will use this method against China after the United States drilled the first oil well by humans in 1853. It soon rose to become the world's most powerful oil-producing country. For nearly a century, its oil production volume led the world. During World War II, the United States produced 100 million tons of oil annually, accounting for 63% of the world's total. It is precisely because of abundant oil resources that the United States was able to support its industrialization and mechanization processes. In 1934, Germany's oil consumption was 3 million tons, of which only 238,000 tons were domestically produced. After Hitler came to power, he deeply knew that energy shortage was the bottleneck for Germany to launch wars. Germany needed to import oil from the United States, Romania, Venezuela, and Iran. Once the British blockaded the sea routes, Germany would surely be in a situation of having no oil available. Therefore, Germany provided huge subsidies to encourage private enterprises to develop synthetic fuels. The production cost of these fuels was 4 to 5 times that of ordinary gasoline. By 1939, Germany's synthetic fuel production reached 2.2 million tons. But at this time, Germany's oil consumption had increased to 7.5 million tons from January to September 1939. Germany's oil imports reached an all-time high of 5.165 million tons. After the war broke out, Germany was immediately blockaded at sea. In 1940, oil imports plummeted to 2.075 million tons, of which 657,000 tons came from the Soviet Union. Germany still had 492,000 tons of aviation fuel and 1.118 million tons of heavy oil and diesel, which was only enough for 3 months of consumption in peacetime. Fortunately, when occupying Poland, Norway, Denmark and France, 1.5 million tons of refined oil were captured. After the outbreak of the Soviet-German War, Romania became Germany's only oil exporter. But the oil transported to Germany decreased month by month from 220 to 1,800 tons in October 1941 to 73,000 tons in February 1942. In May 1944, Britain and the United States began to bomb synthetic fuel factories and Romanian oil fields. The output of synthetic fuel factories dropped from 5.6 million tons to 17,000 tons. The German Air Force could not even maintain training. The fuel reserves of the Army's armored forces were extremely scarce and could only use a large number of horses. Germany was doomed to failure. Japan also died from a lack of oil. Japan does not produce oil and mainly purchases oil from Indonesia, the United States, Mexico and the Middle East, and has established strategic oil reserves. Before the outbreak of the Pacific War, Japan had an oil reserve of 8.5 million tons. After occupying the southern oil fields, 2.65 million tons were shipped back in 1 year. However, after 1944, after the U.S. Navy submarines sank a large number of Japanese oil tankers, the oil transportation volume sharply decreased to 1.06 million tons. Therefore, Japan began to allocate oil on a quota basis. The supply and demand of oil were tight, and industrial production capacity dropped sharply. In March 1945, the U.S. Army launched the Starvation Campaign and sank or damaged more than 670 Japanese ships by air mining. Japan's import of materials decreased by 90%. The supply of strategic materials such as oil, coal and grain urgently needed to maintain the war was completely interrupted. By August 1945, the Japanese economy was completely paralyzed. Military-industrial enterprises all stopped production. And the army didn't even have oil for going to war. The United States defeated two powerful opponents with oil. Now, when facing China, an even more powerful opponent, it naturally thinks of this method again. China's population accounts for 21% of the world's population. But its oil supply only accounts for 1.8% of the world's oil supply. Although China has abundant hydropower, nuclear energy, coal and natural gas, the oil for use in airplanes, ships, vehicles and boilers is gradually drying up. The recoverable crude oil reserves are only 24 billion barrels. It has already faced the dilemma of Daqing oil field entering a high water cut period, the deterioration of oil quality in Huabei oil field, Shengli oil field being nearly exhausted, and the high oil transportation cost of Xinjiang oil field. The prospect of domestic oil production is also increasingly worrying. In 1978, China's oil production reached 100 million tons and became a relatively important oil-producing country. However, since 1993, it has become an oil-importing country, with a rapid development of economy and trade. In less than 10 years, it has changed from an oil-exporting country to the world's second-largest importer. In 2003, China's car ownership increased by 80% in 4 years, and energy demand increased by 30%. Its own oil production was less than 200 million tons. It required 100,000-ton oil tankers to arrive at the port every day to meet China's daily oil consumption. With the development of China's economy, the degree of dependence on oil has also risen sharply. In just the first half of 2004, it increased by nearly 40%. Among the 31 provinces and municipalities directly under the central government, 24 of them had energy demand exceeding supply, and only energy allocation strategies could be adopted. In 2018, China's crude oil imports were 462 million tons, and the daily import volume exceeded 10 million barrels. The degree of external dependence exceeded 70%. At that time, many experts predicted that if it increased at an average annual rate of 7%, then by 2020, China's oil imports would reach 21 million barrels per day, and the degree of external dependence would exceed 80%. China's prosperity depends on long-term and continuous economic growth, and economic growth in turn relies on energy. The demand for energy sources has compelled China to send batches of diplomats and managers around the world, waving cash to solve its thirst for energy. National leaders frequently visit oil-rich countries from Algeria to Uzbekistan. China builds roads and bridges in Africa in exchange for oil exploitation rights. Throughout the 1990s, China signed multiple energy purchase agreements with Africa and Latin America. PetroChina explores for oil and gas and purchases oil fields in 12 countries. The Middle East oil reserves account for about 2/3 of the global total. Naturally, China takes the Middle East as its main source of oil imports. Among China's crude oil import sources, Russia accounts for 15%. The Middle East and Africa account for 53%. South America accounts for 11%. When it is expected to approach the level of moderately developed countries, every drop of crude oil will have to be imported. In 2006, the total global oil production was 4 billion tons. The United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Norway and Australia produced 700 million tons. Russia produced 480 million tons. The Middle East produced 12 billion tons. Mexico produced 183 million tons. Venezuela produced 145 million tons. And Nigeria produced 120 million tons. China only produced 100 million tons. Oil is a commodity with extremely large volume and weight. After being extracted from underground, how to transport it out is a big problem. Highways or railways are not sufficient to fully meet its consumption. Therefore, the most important transportation method is shipping. An oil tanker can carry more than 100,000 tons of crude oil, and the transportation cost per unit weight is very low. After these oil tankers are loaded with crude oil in the Gulf region, they all have to pass through the Strait of Hormuz to the south and then through the Strait of Malacca to reach China. How to safely transport crude oil back from overseas oil fields has become China's most troublesome problem. The sea routes for importing oil have become China's crucial strategic weakness. In June 2006, Aaron Hamilton, director of the Office of Future Strategic Direction of the U.S. Department of Defense, submitted a report to U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, stating that China is building bases along the route from the Middle East to China to protect China's oil shipping. Lawrence Spinett of the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington claimed that the United States should be prepared to fight a high-intensity war. More than 64% of China's crude oil imports depend on maritime transportation. These oil tankers are large in size, slow in speed, and lack self-defense capabilities, making them excellent targets for attack. With its powerful navy, the United States can completely blockade the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of Malacca. If the United States cuts off China's 64% of crude oil imports by sea transportation and plunges China into an energy shortage dilemma, the United States will win the war. The United States can safely use oil as a weapon to attack China without worrying about China using oil as a weapon to attack the United States. The United States is an old oil-producing country and has been the world's largest oil producer and exporter since the 19th century. At its peak, it produced 480 million tons of oil annually, although consumption has also been soaring all the way. After the 1960s, it gradually became an oil-importing country. Although the United States' conventional oil resources cannot be compared with those of the Persian Gulf, there are still many large oil fields in the United States. However, the United States is not willing to exploit domestic oil, the land held by the U.S. federal government. The East and West Coasts and even Alaska are not allowed to explore and exploit oil. There is still a large oil field in the North Slope of Alaska that is prohibited from exploitation. But the United States allows the exploitation of oil shale. Only the oil shale reserves in the Green River Valley in the western United States reach several trillion tons. It will take tens of millions of years for this oil shale to naturally become oil. However, the United States has developed a complete set of extraction technologies including hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, which can extract natural gas from oil shale that was originally impossible to mine. This has led to a rapid increase in the production of shale gas in the United States, reaching 1 trillion cubic meters and surpassing Russia to become the world's largest natural gas producer. At the same time, the United States also uses hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling technologies to extract tight sandstone oil, prompting the United States oil production to rebound to an annual output of 380 million tons in 2012. The vassal state of the United States, Canada, originally had only a few billion barrels of oil reserves. However, due to its abundant oil sand resources, which can be converted into oil after a series of refining processes, its reserves have suddenly surged to more than 170 billion barrels, making it the oil resource country second only to Saudi Arabia. Moreover, all of Canada's oil is exported to the United States. There are huge oil fields under the sea near Mexico and Brazil of the United States, so the United States does not need to worry about the oil problem at all. After World War II, the United States established an overwhelmingly superior sea and air force, thus turning the ocean into its own inland lake. It can freely surround and blockade the sea lanes of other countries without worrying about other countries blocking its own sea lanes. Moreover, the United States does not have to rely on oil from other countries domestically. In contrast, China is facing a much more severe environment. Crude oil production is limited, and overseas procurement faces various risks such as embargoes, blockades, unrest in oil-producing countries, or price hikes. Once there is a shortage of crude oil, the economy will immediately come to a standstill. Therefore, on the one hand, China is vigorously developing electric energy. On the other hand, it is fully constructing the Russia-China oil pipeline and building naval bases in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and Cambodia, strengthening Nansha and Hainan Island, and establishing a blue water navy capable of controlling sea lanes. In terms of the current scale of the Chinese Navy, it is no longer possible for the United States to blockade China by relying on its navy.